Can I recreate the fourth opening of Inazuma 11 Go Uchikudaku entirely in 3D? Previously, I recreated the opening of Inazuma 11-1 in 3D, and you guys absolutely loved it. So this time, I'm taking on something. Anyways, I will do one of my favorite opening of Inazuma 11 Go. This opening is simply incredible. The first time I heard it, I got chills. The electrifying tension of the match, the mysterious enemy they face, the action, the emotion, it's all there. And today I'm taking on a huge challenge, using all the tools and software I've learned so far to bring this masterpiece to life in 3D. Back in the day, I used to celebrate every 1000 subscribers with fun little edits. Now my channel has grown so much, I'd literally need 4 arms to keep it up. And that's all thanks to you guys. So thank you so much. If you want to support this crazy project, don't hesitate to subscribe, turn on the notifications and share the video. Or this little cute cat will die because of you. Or else, Julia Blaze will never wake up. Yes. And Axel will be very angry. So you know what you have to do. It's after creating the first opening of Inazuma 11 that I realized just how challenging is it to recreate an opening from scratch. That project taught me what I'm capable of and what could be more difficult for me to handle. One big advantage of working on an opening is that you already have clear reference. You know exactly which pose to create, so you can focus entirely on execution and perfecting the rendering of each shot. This part can take a huge amount of time when you're working on a 3D project. Since I'm not a 3D professional, this will also help me to hone my skills for future projects. I've already thought about how I'll split the work across different software. First, I'm going to use Blender and Cascadeur for movement and animations. That's because I'm much experienced with these tools and they offer some really helpful features like graph functions in Blender and auto posing in Cascadeur. For texture, I'll stick to Photoshop simply because I know it inside out and it worked perfectly well for the first opening I recreated. Then there's my favorite tool, After Effects, which I use for special effects and to fix teeny details frame by frame. And finally, for rendering, I'll be using Unreal Engine, which I discovered a little while ago. After following few tutorials, I quickly realized the insane potential of this software. Its graphic and rendering speed are just incredible. I decided to dive in and learn how to use a camera, create a timeline, import 3D models, animate, sculpt, render, do tracking, basically everything. What I found amazing about Unreal Engine is the sequencer system. Unlike Blender and other tools which only offer one timeline, Unreal Engine allows you to multiple timelines for the same model. That means you don't need to recreate the same model for different scenes. You can just use the same one across all the sequences. This really helped me to stay organized. That said, I'm not a huge fan of creating movement outside of the rendering space in Unreal Engine. I like seeing the animation next to the other models in real time and understanding how much space it takes up. So I avoid Unreal Engine for complex movement. I've already used Unreal Engine for my Eternal Blizzard but on fire with Axel Blaze, so I got some practice with it there. And I'll assure you, you will see the difference compared to Blender, especially since I find it almost impossible to use Blender in cycles mode for large projects. To tackle a long project like recreating an opening in 3D, you need structure and organization. There are no point in rushing. Setting up proper folders, renaming files, and paying attention to small details are all essential to save time later. For example, spending a few seconds renaming a model now can save you minutes when you're trying to find it later. So I kept the project in the back of my mind while working on other edits, and once I felt ready and had everything I needed, I jumped in. 3D Works covers so many areas: modeling, texturing, rendering, animation, and I'm really bad at modeling. To help me with this project, I decided to use 3D model from the Inazuma 11 video games. Most of the model came from the Inazuma 11 games on 3DS and Strikers. I had to learn how to extract each model, then retexture them one by one to get the look I need. At first, I made some mistakes, like renaming the multiple model with the same name. Big mistake. When I exported the models, they all shared the same texture. It was really awful. I had to fix everything in Unreal, but luckily this only affected the Raymond characters. Next, I analyzed the opening to figure out how many scenes I need to recreate in Unreal Engine. The most iconic scene in the opening, and one most people remember, is the Zenith field. I decided to start with that. I worked on adjusting the field to make it look as close as possible to the original opening. This required some sculpting, but nothing crazy. It also helped me to practice working with texture. For some reason, the field texture was gray at first, so I recolored it green with the right shade to match with the original scene. I also removed anything unnecessary from the frame to keep the scene clean for the opening. Before diving in, I want to visualize how the field will look in Unreal. I imported the first shot and compared it to the original scene, trying to get the lighting and overall rendering as close as possible. At first, I started with an HDRI, which works well in Blender, but in Unreal, I found an option to manage the cloud directly, and that's exactly what I need. I also had to tweak certain materials to make some transparent and other glow to match the look of the original scene. The default lighting was white, so I adjusted to a warmer golden hue to better reflect the original opening. This became my base settings moving forward. For the characters, I had to manually assign texture to each one. The problem was the original texture were very high quality, so I used an upscaler to quadruple their resolution and get a much cleaner result. Once I was satisfied with the overall look, I moved on to the first scene. The one where the camera descends into the fields with the Inazuma Go logo. This scene also shows the player from both teams, but for now, I decided not to add the logo now. I'll do it later in After Effects. The biggest challenge was framing the camera to match exactly the same angle as in the original opening. It took several tries because I had to sync the timing perfectly. After a lot of adjustment and fine-tuning the camera focus, I finally found the right angle. That's when I realized that Unreal Engine allows you to import a video stream. A super useful feature that already exists in Blender, allowing you to match animation frame by frame. Thanks to this, I could make final tweaks to the camera speed and get a near perfect match with the opening. Unreal has a graph editor similar to Blender, so it was pretty easy to get used to. Once I had the right camera movement, I start placing the Raymond 11 characters. I made a small mistake when setting up in Blender. They had an offset position, so I had to reposition them manually. I also had to scale and play them correctly, making sure everything lined up with the original opening. One great thing about Unreal is that you can place characters outside the sequencer, so they can only appear in the scene when they are needed. In Unreal, we also have the ability to create animations, so I applied a basic idle animation to each character. This saves time because I won't have to reposition them for every shot. I can just reuse them across different sequences. Of course, I had to do the same for Dragonlink. Even though they look insanely cool, I didn't know their exact position, so I looked them up online to accurately recreate their placement on the field. Once that was done, it was time for rendering, which thanks to Unreal Engine was super fast. Next, I moved on the same where Endo, Kido, Otonashi, and the manager watching the match. These shots also include Tsurugi, Kurama, and Kageyama running. I had to carefully position each of them with the right orientation and camera focus to match to the original angle. Then came the scene with the Dragonlink standing still, featuring Guenji and Senguji Daigo. Nothing too special here, except that I had to convert a 2D scene into a 3D, making sure the depth was properly represented. I also separated the Dragonlink from the background to apply a shadow effect later in After Effects. Next, I worked on the shot where Tenma runs forward, dribbling in face of his opponent and executing the zephyr dribble before passing the ball. This animation was much more complex, so I did it in Blender, using a side-by-side reference to ensure the frame perfect synchronization. The running animation in the front facing is nearly identical to the close-up of his feet. So instead of making two separate animations, I just looped the first one. After completing the animation, I realized that Tenma's posture was slightly off, so I had to adjust his orientation to match the original scene. I also made sure Son Goku was properly placed for maximum accuracy. I animated the run in Blender, but I'll handle the forward movement in Unreal Engine to keep it synchronized with the camera. I made sure that both Tenma and the camera move simultaneously, with the speed as close as possible to the anime. One small issue was that, based on Tenma's position, he should be in the center of the field, but in the original opening, there are no visible white lines. So, to stay true to the source, I removed the middle field line by taking the field texture and making it transparent. Next, I adjust some distance and minor details. There are shots where we see Tenma's feet and the ball with a Dragonlink in the background casting a shadow. To replicate this properly, I had to separate the background and the distant character so I could apply the shadow in After Effects. Then, I had to animate the ball as Tenma dribbles. This was completely new to me and turned out to be pretty challenging. The ball doesn't just roll forward, it also bounces back onto Tenma's feet at specific moments. To get this right, I animated the bounce movement in Blender using the graph editor to fine-tune this effect. Also, to make sure the ball rotated perfectly, I had to position its pivot point exactly in the center, allowing it to spin smoothly. After that, I moved on to one of my favorite moments in the opening, when Tenma performed the zephyr dribble. To get this right, I gathered as many references as possible to recreate it in Blender. The animation itself is static, but I'll add the forward movement in Unreal Engine for better spatial accuracy. Next, I animated the opponent and the ball, making sure their movement matched Tenma's dribbles and pass. I also added background characters to enhance the scene realism. Details matter. A more detailed environment makes the animation feel more alive. For accuracy, I included Son Goku, Karia, and Kirino, each with slightly different idle animation. To highlight the zephyr dribble, I added a small animation effect in front of Tenma. One of the hardest parts was getting the ball rotation right, but after a lot of trial and error, I finally nailed it. Next, I moved on the animation sequence where Nishizuno receives the ball, passes it to Tsurugi, and Tsurugi prepares to take a shot. For this animation, I followed the same process as before. I created the animation in Blender using a reference in the background to ensure perfect frame synchronization. I also animated the ball to accompany the player movement. Since the scene was originally in 2D, I had to find the right camera angle to ensure the same composition as in the opening. I needed to animate the ball control movement as it followed Nishizuno while rotating to indicate the motion. The rotation was done in Blender while the transition movement was handled in Unreal Engine. I also add extra details such as Gwenji and Senguji Daigo in the background watching Nishizuno. Additionally, I made sure Tsurugi's head subtly turned towards the ball as he prepares to receive it. After that, I worked on the animation Tsurugi controlling the ball and preparing for his shots. Using Blender non-linear animation module, I accurately recreated his movement. For the shoot itself, I had to ensure the perfect camera angle and ball speed to match the opening exactly, which was quite challenging. I decided to split the shot into two parts. The movement the ball leaves the Tsurugi foot, and the movement the ball travels towards the goalkeeper. I also tried recreating the lightning effect seen in the opening, without much success. But hey, it's better than nothing. Then, I had to separate the goalkeeper and the defender from the background to apply shadows in After Effects. While Tsurugi was controlling the ball, I also made a slight scale adjustment to create a subtle cushioning effect, making the control feel more natural. The next scene was Senguji Yamamoto's save. First, he gets up to watch the action unfold. I animated this in Blender, imported in Unreal and rendered in different separated scenes. I also added a glow effect in After Effects to emphasize the movement. Initially, I considered animating the save in Cascadeur, but eventually decided to do it entirely in Blender, as it's relatively simple. with the right reference and camera angle, I got the result I wanted. I then added impact effect and subtle light shadow in After Effects. I struggled a lot with the next scene, the one where everyone is in shock, not because of the character emotion or pose, but because it was incredibly hard to align them onto that small triangle formation like in the opening. Camera positioning made this very tricky. I ended up with a decent result, but it's far from perfect. I'm not too proud of it. Then came the moment when Senguji ejects the ball into the air. At this point, we see Tsurugi, Ariane and Kageyama reacting slightly, along with the Dragonlink player preparing for an acrobatic shot. I had to find the right camera angle and distance to ensure that we see the ball's trajectory clearly. I also added focus shift to make a more dynamic and realistic effect. While the ball is in the air, the scoreboard appeared briefly. To replicate this, I took the texture, modified it in Photoshop and added both team crest and score, making it identical to the opening. I also applied a slight blur to match with the original effect. Additionally, I removed the goalpost on the far side to enhance the composition close to the opening as possible. Now I move on to one of my favorite moments of the opening, the Dragonlink player bicycle kick. Since this animation was very technical, I used Cascadeur to create it. One of Cascadeur's biggest advantage is its auto-posing feature, which maintains natural movement flow despite complex character positioning. This tool is amazing for fluid, physically accurate motions. I highly recommend it. Thanks to Cascadeur, I was able to animate the bicycle kick smoothly, even though the character pose was quite extreme. After that, I separated the character from the background to refine the motion blur in After Effects. I also added a vibration effect during the shot to enhance the impact. Next, I animated the ball hitting the ground and violently projecting toward the goal. To enhance the impact effect, I increased the focus, creating a flattening effect upon contact. Initially, I considered adding debris, but I instead went for a wind animation which fit better with the original animation style. Thanks to my reference footage, this animation came together efficiently in terms of timing. I also quickly found the right camera angle. For the ball rotation, I handled it in two stages. Upon contact, it flattened slightly on the Z-axis while rotating. As it accelerated across the ground, I increased the rotation speed on all axes for a realistic motion effect. Then came the player knockbacks. I imported the character involved Tenma, Kurama, Sengoku, Kirino, Amagi, and Kariya. I also worked on a smoke effect for the ball, adding rotational trails and stone debris to simulate the force of the shot. For Kirino's reaction, he ran slightly before getting launched into the air. I simply reused Tenma running animation from his dribble sequence. Because the scene is short and, let's be honest, as for their actual ejections, I didn't overcomplicate things. I simply added upward and backward transitions depending on each character position. Then I recreated the scene where Tenma crashes to the ground, adding a smoke effect for realism and accuracy. Since every detail matters, I made sure that Tenma's legs fall with a slightly delay after his body, just like in the original scene. For the ground gripping the ground animation, I initially planned to continue directly from Tenma fall animation in Blender, but instead I used a simpler method. I only moved the character arm, keeping the rest of the body in its initial position 0. This made the animation much easier to execute. I created the movement in Blender, then imported it into Unreal Engine. Next was Tenma's desperate expression while lying on the ground, looking at Dragonlink player towering over him. I positioned him in a laying pose, added slight head movement, and modified his facial expressions to make the scene more dramatic. To emphasize his exhaustion and injuries, I added small black marks and scratches to his face. Since the Dragonlink player slightly overlapped Tenma's view, I used a separated render approach so I could erase unwanted details in After Effects. I carefully placed the Dragonlink player in the 3D space to compensate for the difference from the 2D opening. Their layer separation will also allow me to add shadow effect in After Effects. For the flashback scenes, I mainly reused Raimon Go Academy as it had everything I needed, including the tree and the foliage, which were already well placed. I also used the interior field of Raimon Go as a key environment to create the right atmosphere. I played around with different effects in After Effects and adjust the brightness and color settings in Unreal Engine. This allowed allowed me to achieve the different lighting moods I wanted for each moment in the sequence. At first glance, this part may seem simple, but it involved a lot of careful adjustment. For instance, when Tenma turns around to face the academy, I had to ensure that the character rotation was smooth and matched the timing of the scene. Meanwhile, when Shindu is crying, I added a subtle shadow of a tree over him, something I randomly found on Google. Then I enhanced the scene further in After Effects, adding depth through light and shadow correction to give it a more cinematic feel. For the scene where Tenma appears exhausted, I must admit I didn't put as much effort into as I should have. Since the scene was very brief, spending too much time perfecting every detail didn't seem practical. Instead, I created a similar animation and moved on. To add more life to the background, I positioned the Raymond character in the right spot, ensuring their movement aligned with the overall composition. One of the trickiest parts was Endu's scene, where he stands with the wind blowing throughout his hair. Logically, his orientation in the 3D space didn't make much sense, but I adjusted to fit the aesthetic I was aiming for. To enhance the atmosphere, I worked separately on the cloud, rendering them individually to layer them properly in the final composite. Shu's scene followed a similar approach. The key difference here is that I adjust the brightness settings to create a sunset effect. I maintained this sunset tone for another important moment. Tenma juggling the ball alone on Raymond's field. The lighting played a crucial role in making the scene feel nostalgic, so I tweaked the exposure and shadow accordingly. Now let's talk about the part I'm not particularly proud of it. The scene where Tenma falls was honestly a bit rushed. I was feeling lazy when I was working on it, so I didn't go all out on the details. The same thing appears on the Guanji scene when he's wearing his hood. I was so unmotivated that instead of modeling the hood by myself, I just searched for hood on Sketchfab and grabbed the first one I found. Not my proudest moment, but it worked well enough for the shot. As for the spinning ball, I found a random ball model on Sketchfab and simply added Inazuma's signature lighting effect to it. I used a particle effect to generate floating rocks spinning randomly around the ball. Surprisingly, this turned out really well and I was quite happy with the final results. Next comes the scene where Tenma, fully determined, unleashed his Kenshin. My main goal was to create Tenma animation in Blender, then use special effects, facial expression and camera tracking in Unreal Engine to achieve the best possible result. In this scene, Tenma is shown from the back, crossing his arm before releasing his energy. The animation itself was moderately complex, but it didn't take me too long to find the right angle and the timing. As always, I had to carefully position the Dragonlink player, later separating them during the rendering to apply shadow effect in After Effects. I aimed to find a balance between smooth rotation and an animation that closely resembled the opening sequence. For the camera rotation, I used a built-in camera rail from a preset, then applied a tracking to follow Tenma. Once the tracking was complete, the camera had to quickly pull back to reveal the warrior spirit animation, which it was also rendered separately from Tenma. The aura was particularly challenging. It kept overlapping Tenma and I didn't like how it looked. To fix this, I decided to place the background instead. I relied on light effect and shadow in After Effects, as I found it much easier to manage given my experience with the software. With that step complete, I moved on the Kenshin animations. This part was quite complicated, but one major advantage was that for once the Kenshin were set against a black background, a true lifesaver. I manually animated each Kenshin movement, ensuring they were as faithful possible to the original anime. After that, I added a combined effect using saber and glow in After Effects, which one got me very close to the anime look. For their movement with the scene, I did not use 3D layers. I worked exclusively on 2D. On After Effects, I simply zoomed out and adjusted their positions, which was more than enough to achieve the desired effect. I I then moved on to recreating 10 mass shot animation to close the opening. To transition to the final image, I used the spinning ball effect as a smooth transition. At this stage, I placed all the characters in the scene, carefully positioned them in their respective poses. To match the opening composition, I rendered them separately, ensuring their movement aligned properly. This time, the characters were in 3D, but they remained static, just like the original opening. So I also scaled up Gwenji and Senguji Daigo, placing them on a separate layer. After that, I added the ball and applied effects in After Effects to get the best possible results. Finding the right logo for the opening turned out to be a real struggle. Some of them had different colors, so I had to manually adjust them in Photoshop and After Effects. Once the logo were correctly placed, I moved on to recreating the first scene, which was a really challenge since I had no idea how to approach it. The main issue, I have never modeled anything on that scale before, so I have to confess I used some AI to generate a tower model, making as close as possible to the reference image I had. I then brought it into Unreal Engine to set up the scene, importing a bridge I downloaded from Sketchfab. After that, I carefully adjusted the lighting to match the original scene. This proved to be quite tricky. When I placed a light source too far, it disappeared, forcing me to walk around to solve the problem. To perfect the scene, I removed certain materials here and here, making sure it looked just right. Once everything was set, I moved to After Effects to create a crack effect using a special animation technique. I also added special details and lighting effect to refine the look of the animation. Lastly, I added the Inazuma logo, finishing with an effect called scatter. For the subtitles, I carefully translated each line, making sure to transcribe them accurately with precise formatting. I took my time to position and adjust them correctly, ensuring the timing was spot on. In total, this process took me about 50 minutes, and after all that work, I finally realized I was done. After one full month of insane effort, I am proud to present the final results.